Hi friends, how are you? I hope you're doing well. So, let's get started. I'm Obama, and this is my story. In this story, you'll learn how I struggled with speaking English, and I hope it motivates you. I'm not weak in English. I've always been someone who could read well. Ever since I was a kid, I would pick up books, and the words seemed to just make sense. I understood the stories, the grammar, the expressions. Reading was never a problem for me. As I got older, that didn't change. I could get through novels, textbooks, articles, whatever. I'd read online, follow discussions, and even write my thoughts clearly. But when it came to speaking, that was a different story. I always felt like I knew the words, but the moment I had to say them out loud, it was like I didn't know anything at all. In high school, we had presentations in class, and I hated them. I'd spend hours preparing. I'd write everything out, practice in front of the mirror, and rehearse over and over. I felt confident until it was time to actually speak in front of everyone. The second I stood up there, my heart would start racing. I'd open my mouth, but the words wouldn't come out the way I wanted. They'd get stuck, or I'd mix them up. I knew what I wanted to say. I could see the words in my head, but they just wouldn't flow out of my mouth. It didn't make sense to me because I knew the material so well. I could write it down perfectly, and I understood everything when I read it. But the moment I had to speak, it was like all that knowledge disappeared. My classmates seemed to have no problem talking. They'd get up there and speak confidently, while I stood there feeling like I was on a different planet, unable to communicate what I knew I could. After high school, I figured things would get easier in college. I thought maybe with more practice, I'd overcome this issue. But even in college, the same thing happened. I excelled in written assignments. I could write essays that my professors praised, and I had no trouble reading dense academic texts. But group discussions and oral presentations still filled me with dread. It was the same feeling all over again. I'd prepare, I'd practice, and then when it was time to speak, my mind would freeze. I remember one class where we had to give a presentation on a topic we researched. I knew my subject inside and out. I'd spent weeks reading and writing about it, but when I stood in front of the class, I couldn't get through the first sentence without stumbling. My hands were shaking, and my voice felt weak. My professor was kind and told me to take my time, but the more I tried, the worse it seemed to get. It felt like I was letting everyone down, especially myself. My classmates didn't seem to understand. To them, speaking came naturally. They could engage in discussions, debate ideas, and present their thoughts without breaking a sweat. I envied that. I wanted so badly to be able to speak the way they did, to feel confident when I opened my mouth. But no matter how much I practiced or prepared, the anxiety always took over. It made me feel like I was missing something that everyone else had. I tried to figure out what the problem was. I thought maybe I just needed more practice. So I started talking to myself at home. I'd read articles out loud, I'd pretend to give presentations in front of the mirror. I'd even record myself speaking. But even though I knew the words and I could read them just fine, speaking them still felt unnatural. It was frustrating because I knew I understood English. I had no problem reading or writing, but speaking, that felt like a different language entirely. This became even more apparent when I got my first job after college. It was an office job, mostly involving paperwork and emails. I was great at the written part. I could handle reports, emails, and everything else that required reading or writing. But then came the meetings. I dreaded meetings because that's when I had to speak. I'd sit there listening to my coworkers discuss projects, and I'd have ideas, but I couldn't find the words to jump in. When it was my turn to speak, I'd freeze. I knew what I wanted to say, but the words wouldn't come out the way I wanted. It wasn't that I didn't understand the conversations. I understood everything perfectly. I just couldn't express myself verbally. My coworkers were supportive, but I could see the confusion on their faces when I struggled to explain something that was clear in my mind. I started avoiding situations where I'd have to speak in meetings. I'd send emails instead of calling, and I'd let others take the lead in group discussions. It wasn't that I didn't have anything to contribute. I just couldn't figure out how to say it out loud. Outside of work, the same thing happened. I'd be at a coffee shop or a social event, and I'd want to join the conversation, but something held me back. I'd rehearse in my head what I wanted to say, but by the time I worked up the courage, the moment had passed. I felt awkward, like I didn't belong in the conversation. It made me avoid social situations more and more. I didn't want to put myself in a position where I'd feel embarrassed or frustrated because I couldn't speak the way I wanted to. I knew I had to do something about it, so I decided to take conversation class. I thought maybe being in an environment specifically designed for speaking would help. The class was filled with people who were trying to improve their English too. It was comforting to know that I wasn't alone, that there were others who struggled with speaking. But even in that supportive environment, I found myself stumbling over my words. We'd practice conversations, and when it was my turn, I'd freeze. The instructor was patient and encouraged us to keep trying, but I felt like I wasn't making any progress. What I realized through those classes was that speaking wasn't just about knowing the language. It was about confidence, rhythm, and comfort with making mistakes. But even knowing that didn't make it easier. I still felt that same mental block every time I tried to speak. It was like there was a wall between my brain and my mouth. And no matter how much I practiced, I couldn't break through it. I started reading about language learning and speaking anxiety. I found out that I wasn't alone in feeling this way. A lot of people who learn a language, especially through reading and writing, struggle with speaking. It's a different skill that requires practice, patience, and a lot of trial and error. But even with that knowledge, it didn't change how I felt in the moment. I still felt like I was failing every time I opened my mouth to speak. I've tried different techniques to improve my speaking. I've done shadowing exercises where I repeat what I hear from a podcast or video. I've practiced speaking slowly, focusing on pronunciation. I've tried speaking with friends who are more patient, who know that I struggle but encourage me to keep going. It's helped a little, but I still feel that gap between my understanding of English and my ability to speak it fluently. Sometimes I wonder if it'll ever get easier. I've made progress, but it still feels like I have a long way to go. I'm not where I want to be, and that can be frustrating. I see people who seem to speak effortlessly, and I wish I could do the same. I know I have the knowledge. I know I can read, write, and understand English just as well as anyone else. But when it comes to speaking, I feel like I'm back at square one. It's strange because I've always thought of English as something I'm good at. I excelled in school, I've always loved reading, and I've never had trouble writing. But speaking? That's a whole different challenge. It's like my brain and my mouth aren't on the same page. I know the words. I can picture them in my head. But when it's time to say them, they don't come out the way I want. I've come to realize that this is something I'll probably have to keep working on for a long time. It's not going to magically get easier overnight, but I'm determined to keep trying. I don't want to let this hold me back anymore. I want to be able to speak as confidently as I can read or write. I know it's possible, but it's going to take time. For now, I'm still on that journey. I'm still practicing, still pushing myself to speak, even when it's uncomfortable. It's not easy, but I'm not giving up. I've come too far in my understanding of English to let speaking be the thing that stops me. I just have to keep going, one conversation at a time. One day, I had a breakthrough moment. I was in a meeting at work, and we were discussing a project. As usual, I was nervous, but this time I decided to try something different. Instead of focusing on saying everything perfectly, I just started speaking. At first, the words came out a little clumsy, but I kept going. I didn't stop to correct myself or overthink it. I just let the conversation flow, and to my surprise, it wasn't as bad as I thought. After that meeting, I felt a little more confident. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. I realized that part of my problem was that I was trying too hard to be perfect. I wanted every word to come out flawlessly, and when it didn't, I'd panic. But speaking isn't about perfection. It's about communication. As long as I was getting my point across, that was what mattered. Looking back on my journey, I realized that speaking English was never just about knowing the right words or grammar. It was about learning to let go of perfection. I had spent years convincing myself that every sentence needed to be flawless, that every word needed to sound polished. But the truth is, communication is messy sometimes. It's about getting the message across, even if it's not perfect. What I've learned is that progress comes from persistence, not perfection. I used to fear speaking because I didn't want to make mistakes. But now I understand that mistakes are a part of learning. It's in those awkward moments, those stumbles, that we grow. I've come a long way from the person who froze in front of a classroom or stayed silent during meetings. I still have moments of doubt, but I keep going, knowing that each step forward brings me closer to the confidence I've been chasing. Now, when I look at where I started, I feel proud. I'm not just someone who can read or write in English anymore. I'm someone who can speak, someone who can engage in conversations and contribute my thoughts. It didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't easy, but it happened. And that's all that matters.